Welcome to the second video in our work sampling series. In the first video, we talked about what work sampling is used for and went through these steps about how to design a work sampling study, and you had some activities to complete so that you could be ready to design a study for your project in class. We're going to move on now in this video and talk about what the advantages and disadvantages of work sampling are. So you can see a whole list here, and I'm not going to touch on every single one, but some of the advantages of work sampling are that it's relatively inexpensive. You don't have to be as highly trained to do a work sampling study as you do to complete a direct time study. As I mentioned in the prior study, we can look at multiple subjects at a time. If we're looking at maybe, for example, the mills down in our manufacturing lab, we can evaluate all 10 mills, however many they are, at one particular time rather than do a time study at each single one. And that being because we're looking at the categories of work, for example, on the mills, not how much time it takes to do work on the mill itself. And then in the video that you watched about the nurses, it looked at the nurses as a whole for the floor rather than looking at the activities of a single nurse. And so it was more representative of the nurses in that area on that floor to incorporate what everyone does instead of what just one nurse does. Let's see. And relatively simple because we just define, are we looking at people or machines, for example, and what kind of categories are we going to look at for each of those subjects. And we went through some of those examples in the prior slides of that. So relatively simple, just doing a little check sheet, listing the categories, and then how many times you see that category happen in your instantaneous observation. Let's see, you involve the first line supervisor, which really you should do in direct time study, also review the information with them, but you can talk to them about getting what the types of categories are, what their expectations are. It's a nice high level view of the larger system, of the larger work area for management. And I didn't talk about confidence limits and accuracies, but that's part of the statistical significance that I did mention in the prior video. And you'll see this confidence limits and accuracies when we go through the example problem. So we can talk about how accurate the study is. So how much error, what is the margin of error in that? And confidence limits, we can say like 1 standard deviation away from the center on a normal curve. So 68% of the population is captured, or we're confident we have 95% of the population, which is the problem we're going to go through, or we're confident that we've covered 99% of the population. And so we can add some additional robustness to the data analysis by having that as statistical analysis to go through with work sampling. And it's particularly appropriate for indirect labor because they have the longer types of jobs, they have different types of jobs where it's not really short repetitive cycles, but we might want to look and see, like in the nurses would be an example of the indirect labor. So how much of their time is spent communicating, how much of their time is spent cleaning, how much of their time is spent answering the phone, and then look at that, is that really appropriate for what that type of worker should be doing, or should that type of work be moved off to a different skill set, for example. Okay, so those are some of the advantages of work sampling. And then we would have follow-up tools because once we complete the work sampling analysis, we haven't identified what the problem is. We've just identified that there's an area that we want to go research and collect more data on. So you can see this in the big yellow text box here, is it's a superior problem identifier. Might be looking at value added versus non-value added, how much time the machine is idle, what percentage of the time the machine is idle, that kind of thing. And then we would have to go dig down further to see how are we going to make an improvement on that. So it's not, as it says here, it's not a detailed methods improvement techniques, but it helps us identify where problems are. And that maybe should remind you of a little bit of the Pareto chart, and that the Pareto chart helps us identify which problems we want to work on. This is maybe a different way of looking at that and how we can narrow down the area of focus so that we hit the areas that are going to give us the biggest benefit. And so some of the follow-up tools would be work simplification. So principles of motion economy would be, how do we have the material laid out? Is it in the order that we use it? Are we having to retch or street reach or stretch, sorry, to go get it? Do we have to get up out of our chair and go back to the stock room many times to get it? So those kinds of things. How the work is going, what the workstation layout is. Work measurement. So maybe we need to, if we see we have a vast majority of our time is productive, value added, then maybe we need to do some work measurement on there to see if there's anything more detailed work measurement so that we can see if there's anything we can do to reduce the time within that workflow. We can use operations research and simulation. These are 2 more classes you'll be taking later in your career here at Cal Poly. I think IME 420 is simulation, and IME 405 or 305, something like that, is operations research. But we can do some more modeling with the data to see and come up with some specific methods improvements, detailed improvements area, and then facilities planning. If we see maybe transportation or travel was one of the categories, or when we look further into non-value added but necessary, we see that travel time is a lot of it, and so we could use facilities planning with that, in addition to other items that we might notice from the work sampling data we collected. But the point is, we would have follow-on tools to see exactly what we need to do to make the improvement. Work sampling doesn't tell you what improvement you need to make. It helps you identify an area that you need to make improvements in, and then you could use these follow-on tools. And then lastly, what are some of the disadvantages, lastly for this video? We don't have as much detail as the direct time study, or PTS. Does anyone remember what PTS stands for? Are predetermined time studies, which are at the motion level, reach, grasp, move, those kinds of things. So we don't have as much detail as a direct time study or a predetermined time study analysis. And so that would be a little bit of a disadvantage. Chance for bias in the study, we have instantaneous observation. If it isn't very clear and very obviously just at a glance what particular activity we're looking at, even if it could be some bias that could lead us to put a hash mark in a wrong column, for example, or wrong row. Missing individual differences of multiple subjects. So if we see that 30% of the time the machines are idle, we would have to look into more detail. Is that 30% across every single piece of equipment, or is there one equipment out of 3 is down all the time? So a little bit of the disadvantages. The statistical theory is harder to explain to workers, so it's harder for the general population to have an understanding of that and have complete understanding. And then, as I mentioned before, it's not the best measurement for repetitive short cycle work. We definitely want to use direct time study or predetermined time study for that. And then if we want to capture all of the different types of categories, like think about if we're looking at the classroom use or maybe how department chairs spend their time, we'd really want to look at over a whole quarter, I would think, at a minimum, to see how their time is distributed. Okay, and so those are the disadvantages and limitations of work sampling. And that is going to be the case with every tool that we talk about. There are going to be pros and cons associated with each. And so part of your learning here, I hope, is when to identify the best tool for the particular situation, but understand, and in the meantime, understand its limitations and address that as part of the analysis in addition to the information that does provide to you. And then lastly is just a wrap up. We had our work measurement techniques that we talked about at the beginning of the quarter. So we have a direct time study, predetermined time study, standard data, and work sampling. So again, direct time study, predetermined time standards, and standard data, those are all best for this repetitive short cycle work and provides a lot of detail about what is going on with a particular operation. Think about our car assembly process and our flashlight assembly practice that we did for applying direct time study. Versus work sampling, it is a work measurement technique, but not at the level of detail as these 3 up here. It's identifying broad stroke categories of what's going on that we need to drill down deeper in order to find out exactly what we need to do to make the improvement. Okay, so that's the end of our second video for work sampling. So now you know what work sampling is, you know what the steps are to create a work sampling study, you know the advantages and disadvantages, and you're all set to develop a work sampling study and collect data for your project, or if it's not appropriate, for some other area. The next 2 videos we'll be going over a problem, and we'll have part 1 and part 2 of the problem to actually work through the analysis after we have collected the data for work sampling. All right, thank you.